Okay, we're going to go ahead and get rolling. Um, our next speaker is David Cohn. He's basically the Senior Director, Innovation and R&D Advanced Local. He's going to be talking about engaging the audience via SMS and AI. Um, known Dave for a long time, so he's been an innovator year after year. So coming up.
Testing. Oh, there we go. Perfect. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I know that I am in between you all and lunch, and I will wield that power with great vengeance and authority. Yes, David Cohn, Senior Director at Advanced Local for R&D, which I kind of sometimes feel bad when I describe my job because it is a really awesome job. The short version of it is I'm kind of like the local mad scientist at Advanced Local. A lot of people in Syracuse probably know Advanced for Syracuse.com. It's part of the Advanced Local sort of media company. And as a result of that, I do work on lots of different things. And so we're going to be talking about two of them. In this respect, my talk is going to be a little different than others. There will be a connection, but it will also feel like a little bit of a hard pivot at a certain point. So one of the things I'm going to be talking about is using generative AI to boost and understand audience engagement. But first, we're going to talk about SMS. And by SMS, I literally mean text messaging on your phone. So one of the earlier projects that I have worked on with Advanced Local is something called Subtext. Subtext is a platform that allows news organizations or reporters to text with their audience. So literally they have their own kind of CMS. For the user, it feels kind of like an email interface, right? You type out an email and you hit send. But to the end user, it comes out to their text messages, just like they're texting with their friends and family. We do this last month. We sent out almost 4 million text messages. I think this month we probably will get really close to 4 million, as well as next month, partly because of increased texts around the election. I actually suspect probably in December it'll drop back down. This is about our average. We send somewhere between 3.5 and 3.8 million text messages a month. They're not all news, by the way. We work with non-news entities. We work with musical artists. Ozzy Osbourne sent out a text yesterday, and things like that. But we started off out of Advance working with, and this was built for journalists and news organizations. So things like breaking news, headlines of the day, community engagement. We work with large organizations and small organizations. This was a really put together last minute by me, but these are just some of the organizations that actually use us. It ranges from really big, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Hearst, to smaller organizations like Lookout Local Santa Cruz, Wisconsin Watch, Mission Local, etc. I actually will call out Lookout Local. Lookout Local won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news, and they cited their use of SMS. And of the two runner-ups, one of them, Honolulu Civil Beat, I believe it was, also uses us and cited SMS, and they were a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in breaking news. So SMS in breaking news is incredibly powerful. In fact, we'll talk about that in a moment. But why SMS, right? There's a couple really important things. I mean, one of the initial ideas behind Subtext and why we started going into text was we felt the winds sort of shifting against social media, both from the perspective of news organizations. I think they were fed up with their relationship with social media organizations. And I also think the audience was kind of fed up with it, right? So you have a high open engagement rate. You have 98% open rate, right? And also, it's actually where in the US specifically, the audience is, right? I believe it's 98% of US adults text. I don't know who the 2% holdout is, but they do exist, right? Compared to social media, Facebook, the last time I had checked, was at about 80% penetration, right? And it goes down quickly actually from there. Twitter at its height, I think, was maybe like 60% penetration, 40 to 60%, I can't remember. And it might have even dropped down since then, right? So virtually everybody texts. You own your own data. It's not a brokered relationship with a mediator, the social media entity. It is opt-in, so they are friendly. The audience wants to be there. I think, and it's not in here, but you lose trolls, actually. There are still jerks in the world, but there's surprisingly few jerks. There's a lot more trolls than there are jerks. And I think part of the reason is this: trolling is a public act. It is a performative act. People like to troll because it's sort of, I'm getting eyes and attention. But when people respond via text, they're only responding to the host. Only the host can see it. And so they don't get the same sort of jollies out of it. There are still jerks, but very few. The best example of this, again, we'll talk about ways that it's used in different topics, but we do work with a female reporter, one of the best female reporters who covers the Cleveland Browns. And as you can imagine, on social media, being a female reporter who covers football, she gets a lot of crap. She has had no qualms. The only arguments or anything she's ever had has been about whether or not the call was right, or, like football type arguments, which is the good stuff. And so again, I just want to talk about what I wanted to focus on here real quickly was, rather than go into subtext specifically, is this is a medium, ways that it has been used, tips and tricks, things that I have noticed in the last 2.5, 3+ years of doing this. Again, sending out about 3.7 million texts a month with organizations big and small. One is the use cases range. It's not to say that whether an election are the two best uses, these are just the ones that came up. In fact, just last night, as a user myself, I got a text from the San Francisco Chronicle, who we do work with, about a fire in Oakland. I live in Berkeley, California. There was a red flag warning in the East Bay. My house is fine, but they said there's an evacuation in different places in the Berkeley Hills. I called my wife. I was alerted about it from a text message myself as a user, right? And that really does make me appreciate the San Francisco Chronicle. This is from NOLA.com, Hurricane Watch. PolitiFact, I'm getting fact checks daily right now from PolitiFact about the election. And I just wanted to highlight, this is from USA Today, actually, who uses us, about, this is not just necessarily the distribution of information, but about the relationship between an audience and a news organizations. Because if I don't want to necessarily read this whole thing, but you can see here, this was in the recent aftermath of Hurricane Cohn. And this is what it looks like on the back end. Again, for the front end, for the user, it's an SMS, but for the back end, for the news organization. And you can see here, they were saying like, thank you for being there for us. And they ask, is this an AI? Lol, right? Like I sort of just assume it's an AI. And you can see the response. Actually, USA Today, this is a 1-to-1 response, by the way. Just this user got this response. Said, no, we are here, we're answering questions, and they were. Especially during emergencies, actually, is when organizations that are at scale will really try and put as many resources as they can to answer individuals. We'll talk about ways that they do this at scale without having to answer everybody on non-emergencies. But in an emergency, you can see that this is the kind of service journalism that can change lives and create lifelong customers, not to go straight to being, corporate about it, right? But like someone remembers an engagement like this, even with a brand, because it went from, oh, I'm dealing with like some sort of customer service robot to, wow, you guys have been answering my questions, giving me important information, and this is like a real service. And I just want to highlight, this is a similar example from a smaller organization. So this is big to small. USA Today, very big. This was from I always mispronounce it, the Rappahannock News in the Appalachians. And they had something similar, right? And again, during this time, Rap News was able to communicate with almost 600 residents. And again, their response was, wow, these are 600 people who are always going to remember us. It creates a lifelong relationship. Big picture. So I wanted to talk about two types of channels, we call them channels, that we see a lot of. One is what we call the reporter-led channel. The reporter-led channel, in this case, this is from the Washington Post. It was led by Karen Tumulty, one of their sort of political correspondents. And so Tumulty is at the center of it. She is what the subtext channel or the texting channel hangs on. And things that we have learned from channels where it hangs on a reporter. One, you do still need, and I'll hark on this a few times, what I'll call like a launch article. And you can see it here. Right, sign up for texts, right? This was an article in the Washington Post. There's an embed. I'll show you an example of what that looks like. But you need to have a launch article that explains the value proposition, right? It's not too much unlike probably what we're familiar with email newsletters. Like, why am I going to sign up for an email newsletter? Because this email newsletter is about X, Y, or Z, or you're going to get X, Y, or Z. There's about, if I'm going to give you my phone number, you better tell me what I'm going to get. So you want to set the value proposition and set audience expectations. For specific reporter-led text messaging channels, you want to have a great voice, and Karen did a great job with hers, right? And the voice delivers on the expectation. In this case, what they're looking to do is things like drive traffic, but also give kind of behind-the-scenes content, right? This is older. This was from the Republican convention, if I recall. So this is a few months old now, but you can see you're getting things like insights on what is the important thing to pay attention to. Here's a picture, right? Big undeclared turnout here at Bedford High School, right? These are the voters for Nikki Haley. You kind of get that behind the scenes coverage, things that do inform her final stories, but aren't going to be in her final stories. And you get to feel kind of like an insider is essentially what we see with individual reporter-led channels is they want that insider kind of vibe. Great engagement. Karen does a great job. This is a two-way communication, right? So she asks questions. You can see that she asks her audience questions. In this middle one, if I recall, she asked your questions. Yeah. What are your thoughts, right? Reply with 1 if you think it's undermining democracy, or reply with 2 if you think it's merely hardball politics. And this does 2 things. 1, it's a simple way for an audience member to engage. Again, because this is on text, the barrier to respond is super light, super low, right? You can even respond actually with, we did something in the New York Times where they responded with emojis and you could get recipes back, blah. But not only does it poll the audience, and we now have the ability to sort of like do that interesting polling and you can get that data, it also will actually create audience segments. And I'll talk about that in a moment, right? So again, one other thing that I wanted to highlight, and I kind of hinted at this, right? You saw the USA Today, they really, during emergencies, you really want to get in and respond to as many people as you can, because especially, for something like an emergency, these are, serious situations. For Karen, you can see she has a tumulty texter. She started calling them tumult texters. A tumult texter asks, right, is there any hope for the border bill? And then she responded to it. There's a couple really cool things about this. One thing that we have found over and over again, it's that, again, putting emergencies aside, people don't actually expect or demand replies to all their messages. They really don't. They just want to know that they're not texting into a black hole. That Karen is reading this, right? And she can do that just by signaling, by picking. So let's say she sends out a text, she gets 500 responses. In truth, maybe she's scanning the first 100 of them, the first 200 of them, seeing for a trend, right? And she found this question, right? A tumulty asks, is there any hope for the border bill? And by answering it, one, she might be answering 30 or 40 people, right? She probably picked that question because a bunch of people may have asked it, right? And 2, she's signaling to everybody, hey, we're here, we're listening. This is a two-way conversation. You guys are actually informing the sort of way I'm thinking about this, and kind of going back and forth, right? And again, not only does it kind of do all the really positive things we want of driving traffic and et cetera, but I think it creates a kind of authentic connection with readers. And to that first point about polling and stuff like that, it collects first-party data. And again, rather than that being mediated through a Twitter or a Facebook or et cetera, that is data that you now have, which you can use to, again, kind of better understand your audience and serve them better, which I'll show you in the next slide, which is this is a publisher poll, a publisher-led channel. So in this case, it's not a reporter who's kind of front and center. It's the Texas Tribune, the organization. This is one of the other kind of main threads that we have seen. We typically see reporter-led channels, sports, typically reporter-led channel. It's very much like my analysis, my insight, rah for the team. Publisher-led channels tend to be a little bit different. They often are much more about distribution of content. Again, in this one, you can see, oh, sorry, I think I have these slides out of order. Oh, let's see, maybe not. That's all right. And this one, again, you can see they're going for things like, again, the polling, right, to get audience data. But again, that actually gives them the ability to then segment the audience. And so by segmenting the audience in the future, right, they're trying to get people to register to vote. And then they can go back to people that have told them that they have already registered to vote, give them information for those people because they're voters, or people that have said that they haven't registered to vote. You can send them a totally different message. Here's how to go register, et cetera, right? So you can start to treat people essentially differently based off of where there is. And again, in terms of driving engagement or being able to show sort of the relationship between an organization and the public, being able to say, we actually can track people who went from not being registered to being registered to vote, I think is a huge metric, right? I mean, again, it's not a metric that we're typically used to in terms of publishers and numbers and dollars and cents and things, but especially for a nonprofit to be able to say, hey, we actually had 5,000 people and we've tracked 2,500 of them have gone from at least according to our data, from having to register to vote to now they've registered and we've given them more information. Do you have a question right now? Yeah. I don't know. You'd have to ask the Texas Tribune what they meant by it. But it wants to. If you look at the second line, the Texas Tribune wants to help change that. So there you go. So again, you also have the ability to do what we call auto replies. So in this case, again, if you've told us X, Y, or Z, you can get, I sort of just referenced this, but you can combine polling with auto replies and things like that. So not only are you able to then give people immediate information based off of what they told you, I need to register, I'm already registered, here's what you need to know, here's what you need to know, but in the future, you're able to communicate with them going forward in that way. So again, typically what we see has been individual-led channels, publisher-led channels. And I wanted to just go over quickly some of the best practices that we've seen across all of these. Some of them I've already mentioned, right? But the first thing that we have always seen is you want to set expectations. Leverage audience segmentation. Again, ask people questions, allow them to answer those polling questions. They will give you those in a much lighter, faster way via SMS. And from that, it informs your reporting. As you saw with Karen, it'll inform her future stories. She'll highlight when she's asked questions and then when they inform her stories. Encourage two-way communication by asking questions. We do work with some publishers and they set the expectation that they're not going to ask questions. And the audience is not disappointed by that because the expectation was set, hey, we're just going to send you breaking news. The Chronicle that I got that text, the setup is we're going to send you breaking news to your phone so you know about it. They don't really set it up to be engaging in that back and forth, and that's fine. The audience isn't disappointed because it was never set. Be concise, lean into the medium. I think there's a whole talk you could do similar to Tamar's of writing for audio, of writing for text. A lot of it actually is very familiar to a lot of folks. I mean, it's actually a very low production, high return on investment medium. When you respond to someone in text, you don't have to say, like, imagine responding to an email. When you get emails to the editor, you have to respond, dear so-and-so, thank you for the note, blah, blah, blah. Sincerely. In text, you just say, no, the answer was no, or the answer is yes. Thank you for your, it's very low production, very high return on engagement. One other quick tip that I would say on this is, and this is one that I go back and forth with on folks is don't be afraid to text too much. It's actually similar to a lesson that I learned with email newsletters. When people run email newsletters, I'll start with that. A lot of people are really nervous about sending the next email because they're going to get some unsubscribes. And a lesson that I have always learned is, you know what? You want the unsubscribes. People that are going to unsubscribe, they're going to unsubscribe eventually. The sooner they unsubscribe, the better, because then you can focus on the people that remain subscribed. And it is wrong to punish subscribers by not sending a message out of fear that you're going to lose the people who you're eventually going to lose. Like, eventually you're going to have to send that email, right? If you wait, oh, not this week, we'll send it next week. We've been maybe sending too many emails, right? But next week they're going to unsubscribe next week. Meanwhile, the people that did want to hear from you suffered because you didn't reach out. Same with text. And the most important thing in terms of don't being afraid to text too much, and this is why it's two ways, you just ask the question. Hey, everybody, after I tell everybody, like, text as much as you want for the first 2-3 weeks, and then say, hey, everybody, am I texting too much, too little, just about right? 9 times out of 10, what we have found is people say just the right amount or text me more. And you can always then create a segment. Do you want text on the weekend? Yes or no? They say yes. You can send text to those folks on the weekend and not to others, right? So really, those are the lessons. And one other thing that we're going to do, because there's more, is I want to highlight again this idea of you ask questions and you get responses, because that's what we're about to talk about. Is what do you do with all those responses? Let's say I have a text list of 1,000, 10,000 people, and we have text lists of 10,000 people, and I get 1,000 responses. Right? That's a great question. We're going to talk about using generative AI now to boost and understand audience engagement. This is on the analysis side of things. So again, at Advanced, I work on a bunch of different things. A really cool project that I'll talk to tomorrow about later is actually, we do have a project where we are taking the top 5 stories, rewriting them for the ear, and putting them on audio. So it's like, there's lots of interesting things. One thing that I wanted to start off with this actually, in addition to being an egomaniac and just wanting to put a cool GIF of myself in here, is there's actually been a theme that I've heard throughout this with some of the other speakers of everything old is kind of new again. And I've worked on lots of different projects, and actually Spot Us was a project where I first met like Brant and Gary. This now would have been in, gosh, like 15 years ago. I don't know, something like that. But right before that, I worked on, in the early days of what we'll call Web 2.0, crowdsourcing, or what was sometimes called citizen journalism. Brief story time here is there was a reporter named Jeff Howe who coined the phrase crowdsourcing. And in journalism, if you coin a phrase, you get a book deal. Good for him. I'm his research assistant. So I'm a young reporter, and I was really lucky that I felt like I had I got this research assistant learning about crowdsourcing. And at the time, there are these phrases, right? My readers know more than I do. Dan Gilmore, the people formerly known as the audience here. And I feel like a lot of this vibe from, we'll call it the 2005-ish era, give or take a couple of years, either disappeared or kind of got swallowed into social media, I think is maybe 2 ways to interpret it. But I do think there was an important lesson there. So again, from 2004 to 2010, right, there was this practical and intellectual pursuit around the idea of a group's collective knowledge and opinions being more accurate or more important than maybe an individual's. And when I started playing with AI, I thought, you know what? Maybe it's time to revisit that, because I was remembering 2 major problems from that era. The first one I'll describe quickly was, there are certain things that wisdom of crowds really was effective in, and certain ones where it wasn't. So if I had a jar of jelly beans and I said, hey, everybody, how many jelly beans are in the jar? And I got everybody's thing, and I averaged out your all guesses, that would actually be a good use of kind of wisdom of the crowds. Another great use, and we did this one back in the day, was, hey, let's get a bunch of people on bikes in downtown Oakland, everybody go in different directions and note where all the potholes are. And then at the end, you have a map of all the potholes. That would take one reporter like forever to do. Never would do it, right? But we did it in one day. The downside, though, is there are certain things that crowdsourcing was not good for. So if I'm going to have brain surgery, as much as I love you all, I'm not going to ask you all for your opinion and then average out your opinions on how my brain surgery should go. I'm going to look for a brain surgeon, right? Same if I'm on a plane and the pilot passes out. First question is there a pilot on board? Things where there is a time constraint or a certain level of expertise constraint, right? The other problem that I think AI can respond to was, and it was described by Jeff Howe. There was he called it the dirty little secret of open source. The dirty little secret of open source that he described was there always had to be kind of one person as a hub, as a kind of communications hub, we'll call it. Right? They kind of had to keep the community pushing forward. They were the go-to person. Hey, what was the status on this? I mean, you might call it institutional knowledge, just the ability to give anybody else who wants to come into it the background information on, hey, here's how to get in. And he said he observed that same dirty little secret in citizen journalism or crowdsourced projects. He said, like in a magazine, you call that like the production manager, and we need something like that for this, right? And so my question was as well, now that I've got 1,000 inputs from text, or maybe I've got 1,000 inputs from a Google form I just put at the end of an article, which we're doing at Advanced. I mean, it can be anything. You can get the comments anywhere, right? But how do I do this analysis? And so the next slide I'm going to show you is basically this bottom thing right here, right? Collect the input, the generative AI processing. That's what you're going to see in the next slide. which is going to identify important themes and highlight relevant comments. So this will be a video. It's going to go quick. Maybe we'll play it twice. Just so you can see what's going on. I had built like a sort of what we call a reporter's toolkit. A lot of different workflows. With the click of a button, you go to different workflows. One workflow helps you make a headline. One workflow does copy editing. One workflow does this. And one workflow, which we call the feedback loop, will do that, right? So here we go. Hopefully the video works. Oh wait, one more click. There we go. So that's my document with all of the comments in it. These comments are about Kamala, and you're going to upload it, right? These are about who are you going to vote for, Kamala or Trump, and why. What issue will bring you to the voting booth? And it's going to do analysis. I actually voter motivation issues, and theme 1, migrants and border security, a description of that theme, why that theme is relevant, and it picks comments out of the 400. Another, I forgot the other theme 5 here, you can see is climate change, etc. Right? So each of those are comments that best exemplify those themes. And one of the other themes that I've run this obviously many times, it tends to pick out the same themes each time, worded slightly differently because it's, doing some kind of predictive words, but it almost always has immigration, economy type stuff, women's rights, and then I forgot the last one there. Oh, climate comes and goes sometimes. Housing comes and goes. It depends on how many times you run it, but you run it 5 or 6 times. Again, it's really quick. And now, rather than having to go through 1,000+ comments, you still should, but you're going in with an idea of, hey, this is what's going to be at issue. These are the things. And I've also got comments that best exemplify those themes that it has picked out. So it's kind of doing the analysis for you. So what's a use case? We did one in Texas. We own Golf Live. And in Golf Live, they asked Texas residents, what do you think about marijuana laws? They had lots of thoughts about marijuana laws in Texas. And you can see here, one of the themes was medical and health benefits. Another one was economic and legal considerations. Another one is social justice. And each one of these were comments, again, that best exemplified those themes. 2 things that I hadn't thought of that I really liked. One, at the end, the reporter, you can see here, put out another call out. If you could tell Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton one thing to convince him to free the green, what would it be? That turned into another story. So in a very strange way, the back and forth that we're starting to have is, I don't want to overstate it, right? But my dream of it was like almost a Freudian analysis of our readers' comments, right? And just to put this in context, Advance Local removed comments from its sites before me. It was, I don't know, 10 years ago, let's call it. I don't exactly know when. And I understand why. Moderation was a lot of work. The value wasn't necessarily there for the readers. Combine those 2 things, and after a while, it's like, well, why are we spending a lot of time moderating and nobody's getting any value of this? Because it's just a list of random comments. But rather than comments being published, can we take them and turn them into something? Funny enough, within the analysis, sometimes with this, right, when you'd run it 5 or 6 times, it wasn't uncommon to get one theme that was vulgarities and unhelpful comments, essentially. And it picked up. We did get some of those comments, right? And the AI picked up and said, hey, these comments didn't seem to be very helpful and were kind of profanity laden. And that's fine, right? It sort of did that analysis. It was correct in the analysis. And we could just we didn't obviously include that in the article because that was the editorial decision there, right? One other thing that this reporter did that I hadn't thought through was, again, I always kind of pictured this as comments coming in from the public. Sure enough, she comes back to me 2 weeks later. She's like, hey, I got a FOIA request. I got 400 comments through FOIA. Can this do that? I was like, yeah, why not, right? It doesn't matter really where the comments come from. So again, you can get comments kind of from anywhere. In theory, you could maybe even go through different social media things and see the conversation and do an analysis that way, although there's a question about who owns that content. So again, lots of possibilities. So we've done feedback loops on sports teams. That's actually been the biggest use. Go figure, right? Like, hey, here's what we think of what do you think of our defense? What do you think of our new quarterback? All that stuff, right? Feedback on local laws, which you just saw. Feedback on what topics are motivating people to the polls. That was part of the example. We've done everything from feedback in traffic in Staten Island to, we're probably doing this one I'm excited about if it comes through. We did like a kind of true crime podcast about this murder story that has gone cold, and they're going to do a text version of it and say, what do you think, right? Do you have any theories about the case? I don't know if we're going to do that because again, it is a real case, but it was floated, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, if we think it's tasteful, you can do that, right? FOIA requests, etc. Right? So, two quick lessons. Sorry. One, less can be more. The original version of this that I showed you, that workflow, it tried to do too much. And I think by bringing it back to focusing on the analysis and finding key quotes, I think at this point, and it makes sense, reporters still need to be in the driver's seat, and they still need to be able to like turn the wheel and understand kind of what's going on. Prompt chaining is your friend. I kind of referenced that earlier, right? Like, how do you get the word count? Don't try and all put it in. Prompt chaining is something we can talk about more if folks are interested in, but the idea is, again, is just breaking things out into steps, right? Don't try and have an LLM do everything all at once, but have it do a step. So find the themes, find quotes that match the theme. Those are two separate moments, essentially. And of course, adoption means iteration. And that process is just as important. And I think the iteration is for the audience as well as for internally in the newsrooms. I think we as a newsroom need to figure out our process. What is the way that we're going to best adopt these tools? And again, our audience specifically has not done commenting in 10 years on our sites, right? And so we're now bringing them back and saying, hey, do you guys want to start, giving us your thoughts? And I think they need to start to move those muscles as well. I'll pause there. I could talk everybody's ear off, but I want to see if there are any questions first. Yeah.
I've been thinking about the SMS, the subtext thing that you're showing at the beginning, and I can see it being useful for some of the clients that I work with. But here's a question, like, have you paired that with AI to have AI go through all of the comments and like figure out, which one should be responded to and elevated? And if so, is there an easy way to implement that for people who don't have a lot of AI experience at media outlets?
That is something that we're looking into. I mean, and I think our first idea of using AI, like we're actually really cautious not to have AI actually write the responses.
Sure. But just to come through it, because I feel like that's where the workload is.
The way that we're thinking about it again is, right now I mentioned the audience segmentation. That still requires an audience action, right? Like, hey, everybody, what's your favorite color? Blue, green, or red? And then you text back blue, and I put you in the color blue. But I may, in the future, I might not have to ask questions, and just based off of your responses, I will tag you, and the AI might start to categorize you. So the first thing we're thinking about actually is not necessarily about the responses in the ordering of them and the responding of them, but more of what else can we learn about the people that are talking to us and ways that we can start to segment them essentially. It will be so that we know what future communication to give to them, but it'd be about giving to them in segments, so in mass rather than individual responses.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But there is, I mean, again, taking the responses, putting them into the feedback loop is, they're not integrated, but something that we obviously want to do.
A couple of practical questions. What do you do? What's been the experience of news organizations when they want to get people to give me your cell phone number? That's actually a more personal ask than give me your email address. So how does that work? And is there a general rule of thumb based on one's web traffic or subscriber base or whatever, what kind of expectation you could have for the number of people who will turn around and give you their phone number, and how long does it take to build up a critical mass?
Sure. I'm going to try and make I hope I answer all three. I'm going to call that 3 questions, and I hope to, if I get lost, let me know. But in terms of are people willing to give you the information? They are, if you give them a reason, right? There's lots of different ways to sign up. In fact, one thing I wanted to highlight, and I'm not going to, or I'll mention it, is, there's a sign up that can be embedded on a website. There's also a QR code that you can put in. In fact, I have cards here. You can like scan this QR code and it'll sign you up for a Forbes breaking news one. And you can also even just share the phone number. I actually run my own kind of Subtext channel called This Week in Digital Media for like digital media folks. And I was going to share the number, but I forgot it. So there's lots of different ways that people can sign up. And in terms of their willingness to share it, I mean, here's an interesting backstory. And I think I even told this to some of the other panelists the other day. This is a little bit old of a story now, but back when the New York Times had kind of like a digital paywall where you could register without having to pay, you just had to give your email address and then you get behind, you'd be able to see stories. It was like metered. The number one registered country of people was the United States. And the number two, I usually ask people, what do you think the number two country was? And nobody ever gets it right. People guess China, people guess Canada or the UK. It was actually Afghanistan. And the reason is because Afghanistan was alphabetically at the top of the dropdown where I selected what country I'm from. So no, they don't, whether or not someone gives you information is about whether or not you give them a reason to, because those same people registered on Facebook. On Facebook, I'll tell you my girlfriend's name. I'll tell you my favorite books. I'll tell you what movies I've seen. I'll tell you what I ate for lunch because I get value out of it, right? So I will give you my phone number if you can convince me I'm going to get value out of it. If you don't tell me, I'm going to tell you I'm from Afghanistan, right? I really think it is all about, again, setting expectations, making sure you explain what the value is going to be. In terms of the second question, kind of almost like a ratio, it's actually a little bit better, we have seen, than email newsletters. Because again, almost everybody has text messages, and text messaging is a really lightweight way for people to receive information. It's actually a very comfortable way to receive information. If you are someone who is on the go and you really want something, you will actually prefer text over, say, email. And although I should say it does take time, right? I mean, it's like all things, right? Again, it's not too different from starting a new email newsletter product, right? Like if you start an email newsletter from scratch, you start with zero and you have to build it up, and it takes time, it takes repetition, it takes promotion, it takes marketing, all that stuff. If you build it, they will come scenario. Oh, it did work. It's not a, if you build it, they will magically come. You do have to put work into it. In terms of time, I mean, it depends, right? Like hurricane channels will get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in, a week or two, right? Versus, the San Francisco Chronicle just launched one about college admissions. Like, hey, ask us your college admission questions. It's very focused, so I don't even think it's going to get, as big as their weather channel. But that service element of it, of like, hey, we're going to answer your questions about, getting into Berkeley or Stanford or any of the colleges around here. I think while smaller and might not be as big, is going to have that like ability to create a connection that has a higher ROI than 1,000 people on Twitter or 10,000 people on Twitter. Sorry, that was a long answer. I apologize.
I will not switch off the mic this time.
Don't do it. Don't do it, Subu. Don't do it.
So I wanted to applaud you on that story example you gave on Texans are fed up with local marijuana laws. Was that it?
Yeah.
So that is the kind of crowdsourcing thing I was working on during my fellowship at the JSK Stanford thing. And my headline for my article was "Ask and you shall receive," because newsrooms don't ask. So I felt like that kind of framing where they're asking the people and a whole bunch of subtext come back and then they do some analysis, like you said, that headline to me was the giveaway because it's centering the people. It says Texans fed up with that. That you don't see headlines like that unless you ask people what they think. Because otherwise you say, Schumer took McConnell down, McConnell said this, and Trump said this. You're putting the elites in the headline all the time. That's what we do in the old world of press. I wanted to ask you, is there a way to classify from the newsrooms using subtext now? How often is this happening, this particular kind of practice, where they do a story after?
So this particular practice is relatively new. Again, I'm working on a bunch of different things. This came out of, I just finished a AI and journalism lab at CUNY. And this was like my quote unquote capstone. And I just quote unquote, finished it 2 or 3 weeks ago. I had kind of finished it a little bit before, and I forget what the date on this. The date on this was actually one of the earlier. This was in June, right? So since June, we've probably been doing maybe one every other week-ish on average. Again, a lot of them have been sports. What do you guys think of our defense? And the questions and the answers usually are is like, we think our defense sucks. The thing that I would say, 2 other lessons that came out of this, right? I originally was calling this community comments. Because that's the way I think about it. It's like, can you take the comments and like make a story out of it that is really a reflection of the community, a reflection of the comments from the community? And I found out that comments itself was maybe not the right word, at least within advance. I think when people were hearing comments, they're like, oh, they were having a little PTSD of comments. I don't want to. And it was someone else who had been with the organization for a while who said, you should rename it. That's the problem. And I renamed it. And sure enough, all of a sudden people got a feedback loop. And I really do, again, think of it at its best. The way I think of it is it's almost like a Freudian analysis of the community for them to see. It's almost for them to talk to themselves, right? Like lay down on the couch and tell me about, your mom, right? And then the best therapists often will just reflect back what they're hearing, maybe in different words so that you can understand it better.
Hi.
Hello.
You mentioned kind of like not being afraid to overtext. I wonder if that changes depending on like different events that are happening or different times a year. Because I know for me during election season, I'm already getting so overloaded with text messages that like, even if it's a real person behind the screen, if you text me at all during this time, you're probably getting an unsubscribe instantly.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my question is like, are there periods or events where pulling back may be more necessary than overtexting?
I think it totally has to do with the topic. And one, I'd say, political texts are a whole other beast that I've had to learn about, and they suck. Sure enough, you are not allowed to. We are not allowed to text anybody unless they give us their phone number. Go figure. The politicians wrote a rule that they're allowed to text people just by buying the numbers off the voter rolls and things like that. But in terms of your question, like we also have a lot of sports texts as well, and I'm not a sports person, and they were texting like 10 times on Sundays, and I was free. I was like, guys, I was like, you guys are texting 10 times on a Sunday? And they said, no, this is everybody likes that. I was like, will you at least ask? They ask. And sure enough, everybody on that list is like, oh, are you kidding? It's Sunday. That's like, football day. Like, give me as many texts as you can. I think it's totally dependent on the topic and the audience, right? They're all different. If it's a very niche topic like football and your team on Sundays, and it is seasonal for them too, right? Because when games are happening, there's a lot on Sunday. When it's not, when it's the off season, they text, here and there. They're still talking about injuries or whatever. So I think it's judgment. It's editorial judgment. I don't think there's not a texting rule that I would apply. There's an editorial awareness that I would say you should have.
So I'm curious about Subtext as a platform in this context of there's all these different services that can provide, SMS messaging for organizations, for businesses, et cetera. And just how does Subtext, like, I guess, how do you differentiate from the plethora of companies that provide this kind of messaging service?
Sure. There's actually, and Kate will probably speak to this as well, but like, in the texting space, there's actually a ton of texting providers. The vast majority of 90+% of them actually are not competing with us because the vast majority of them are what I call transactional texts. I sometimes jokingly call them the Uber's on its way text, right? Like you've all gotten a text after buying something, it's a receipt, or my Uber's on the way. It's kind of a if this, then that text. What we're doing is what I call narrative texting. It is texting in service of a story, of a beat, maybe, a story that never ends is what a beat kind of is, right? And it is used for, again, being able to allow someone to understand a topic over time, or have that kind of engagement. Most texting platforms are not built for that. They are built for if this, then that. If purchased, text receipt. If Uber, within 5 minutes, text uber alert. So most of them actually are not set up to do a lot of the stuff that we do. Certainly not from an ease of use. Like it requires programmers essentially to do that. And that's not going to work in certainly newsrooms. It's not going to work for musical artists. It's not going to work for most local businesses who want to tell you why, you know, hey, come in, because we're having a, we work with actually a lot of car dealerships. I never would have known as much about car dealerships as I do now, but they have narratives to tell, right? Like, and all of that is not going to be if this, then that.
Sorry, but this is sort of a two-parter. One is about I'm curious about how audience engagement teams fit into this workflow, and so I'll ask that one first. If there's time, I'll do a follow-up.
I mean, well, explain to me a little bit more what you mean, like in terms of what they're doing with things like feedback loop or the or
I mean, I
texting?
think in terms of like there is some element here where you have to identify the people who want to be able to participate in this. And maybe that's actually related to my other question, which is about generational uses of technology. In terms of how, you know, we talked earlier about whether people are willing to receive these kinds of communications and that you have to make it worth their while, which makes sense. But I think, you know, the use of audience engagement teams and really knowing who the audience is and how to reach them could be really valuable here.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how that fits into your process.
Sure. And you know, I hope I didn't gloss over too much when I sort of said, like, you know, like launch article, you need to really think about what the value proposition is. That's where I think audience teams do, like, I often think of it as like when you're building a building, right? Like the foundation needs to be level, right? If it's measure twice and cut once kind of stuff, and audience teams, in my experience, have been the ones that think through who is our audience, who would this be for, what's the pitch to them, how do we market it, how do we get them there, all the kind of practical questions that you were asking, I think is answered by those folks better than the technology. Like the technology is not going to tell you how to do it, right? Again, it's not a build this and they will come. This is really, it's just a medium, right? And the medium is the message, which does change the editorial, but it does take an audience team to understand that editorial, how it should be framed, what it should be thought through. They're the ones that do come up with the scheduling. They're often audience teams. Again, like Karen is actually very hands-on, but we work with, when it's a publisher-led one, it's usually the audience teams that are on it. Some combination of audience or social, you know, are the ones who are actually writing the content, you know, actually doing the practical things, and then doing the analysis of what does or doesn't work, thinking about what are the questions that we should ask, how that should be interpreted, and going from there. Good question. You're all beautiful people.
Any other questions?
When is audio coming? Oh, you can send audio notes, you can send video, you can send images. It's all there. You have to record it, yeah, and then you basically upload it like a file. It does have to. You can't send like a 30-minute video for the, you know, size constraints. Same with audio, right? It has to be relatively short. We also actually, the Ozzy Osbourne one, and we did this for a few musical artists, we have the ability to set up hotlines. They are cheeky with it. They sort of do this 80s retro thing, but you can call and get oh, press 1 for this, press 2 for that. That can then lead you to again, different answers. Well, it could be for voting, right? And we have had news organizations who've used it to inform people. Musicians use it to sort of like, you hit play and you get a sample of the song that's coming out next week. But sorry. It is very, what's old is, I mean, the first time we did it, I was like, oh, it's like a David Hasselhoff like hotline.
I actually have a follow-up based on that. Are there ways to kind of limit harassment? Because I know that the AI can kind of go through text, but if you send an audio note with like racial slurs or what have you in it, or like a really explicit photo.
That's actually a really interesting one that we've so one, you can obviously block anybody, like we can kick anybody out that we want, right? That's post, right? And we went back and forth on when people send images, it defaults to showing the image. And we were really, should we default it where you have to click in to see the image, or and so far it has been, but it defaults to showing. And again, this is tied to people's real phone numbers, right? It is a lot easier to troll in an anonymous thing where it's thousands of people, you like the idea that thousands of people are going to see you being a jerk. But when you're just sending a private photo, you have to be, I've actually been humbled and like sort of uplifted by in the sense in my feelings of humanity by seeing how people respond, because they genuinely respond as individuals who they're not their names are necessarily, but their phone numbers are there, which feels like a name. It's very one-to-one. And so we have had zero problems of anything that would all the horrible things I'm sure we can imagine. We haven't had anything like that. And that's, again, the power of text. Nope. No. All right. Sorry.